Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this panel. I'm Justin Clark. I'm the Communications Director and Archives and History Advocate for the Indiana Archives and Records Administration. This panel today covers Mapping Midwestern Minds, a forthcoming book published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. 26 scholars from across the academic and public history fields have embarked on understanding the intellectual history of the American Midwest. This panel will focus on 7 of these authors and their chapters, each one rich in historical scholarship and insightful analysis. On the panel today is Ray Boomhauer, Senior Editor of the Indiana Historical Society Press, Alan Carlson, Professor of Politics and History at Hillsdale College, retired, William Kostlevy, is that how I say it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The Director of the Brethren Historical Library and Archives and the Archivist, Special Collections Librarian, and Affiliate Professor of Church History, Associate Director of the Wesleyan Holiness Studies Center at Asbury Theological Seminary. David Paczewski? Is that
Paczewski.
Paczewski?
Don't get anything close.
Okay. Professor of English at Southwest Minnesota State University, Michael Steiner, Professor Emeritus of American Studies at California State Fullerton and Gleaves Whitney, Director of the Hauenstein Center here at Grand Valley State University. The format will be as such. Each participant will give a brief outline of their research, and then I will lead the discussion, asking questions on the similar themes and concepts across each author on the panel. Finally, we will open the discussion to all of you, which is always my favorite part. I'll describe my chapter first. My research delved into the public discussions of religion and free thought between 2 titans of Midwestern life during the late 19th century, the free thought orator Robert Greene Ingersoll and the evangelical preacher Dwight Lyman Moody. I analyzed their lives as a dance of competing visions of modernity, with Ingersoll representing secularism and free thought, and Moody representing a modernized Christianity. However, their shared experiences living and working in Illinois profoundly shaped their similarities. As I write, both men used their public platforms to advance a shared conviction of rational individualism, while simultaneously and graciously criticizing each other's worldview. Their dance of ideas at the end of the 19th century underscored the period's profound changes in American religion, philosophy, and culture. I'll now open it up to introductions from my co-panelists, and we'll go in alphabetical order, and we'll start with Ray. If that's okay with you.
Sure,
All
I'll
right.
go first. My chapter in the book focuses on a speech that was given by a new member of John F. Kennedy's administration on May 9th, 1961. And it was by the new chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Newton Minow, who was from Illinois. And I will give you a bit of what his audience thought of his speech by what one audience member said to him. Minow was talking with Leroy Collins, who was the National Association of Broadcasters president, former governor of Florida. After finishing his remarks, when one of the audience members approached the 2 men and said to Minow, "I didn't particularly like your speech." The man left, only returned a few minutes later, saying to the new FCC chairman, "You know, the more I thought about it, your speech was really awful." The man retreated, only to return for a final time to comment, "Mr. Minow, that was the worst speech I ever heard in my whole life." Now, Collins attempted to console the new FCC chairman, putting his arm around his shoulder and telling him, "Don't let him upset you, Newt. That man has no mind of his own. He just repeats everything he hears." So, what had Minow said to this group that made them so upset? Well, he said this. He started by saying, though he respected the honorable profession of broadcasting, there was much left to be done when it came to its obligations to uphold the public interest. He went on to say this: when television is good, nothing, not the theater, not the magazines or newspapers, nothing is better. But when television is bad, nothing is worse. I invite each of you to sit down in front of your television set when your station goes on the air and stay there for a day without a book, without a magazine, without a newspaper, without a profit and loss sheet or a rating book to distract you. Keep your eyes glued to that set until the station signs off. I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland. And those last 2 words, vast wasteland, reverberated and still reverberates today. my chapter takes a look at that speech and what it led to and what came afterwards, but I really focus on how lost in all this that Minow, a Midwesterner from Wisconsin and a former aide to Illinois Governor and Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson, had able assistance for his speech from his friend and fellow Midwesterner John Bartlow Martin, a Hoosier journalist and respected freelance writer and political speechwriter. And this unique partnership produced a speech whose intent and import is still debated whenever broadcasting is discussed. So that's what my chapter looks like.
Awesome. Thank you, Ray. All right, next is Em.
Thank you. My chapter is titled John C. Raw, S.J., and Midwestern Agrarianism. Raw was born 1900 to German immigrant parents and raised on a farm in central Illinois. He entered St. Louis University, graduating with a law degree and a decision to enter the Jesuit order. Jesuit training involved a rigorous 15 years of study, and he spent his last 4 years, this is 1932 to 1936, at St. Mary's College, a Jesuit seminary in Kansas. Here he joined, quote, a zealous seminar of rural life advocates, which turned him into a fierce advocate for agrarian restoration. His written work included a strong denunciation of the privileged legal status of American corporations, which appeared in the Agrarian Manifesto, Who Owns America? A New Declaration of Independence, edited by Herbert Agar and Alan Tate. The document, A Manifesto on Rural Life, ghostwritten for the National Catholic Rural Life Conference in 1939, and co-authorship with Luigi Liguti of the so-called Summa of American Catholic Agrarianism, the book Rural Roads to Security, America's Third Struggle for Freedom, published in Milwaukee in 1940. The theme found in John Raw's work anticipated those later animating that of the Kentuckian Wendell Berry, although with Midwestern and Catholic accents. This was a mix of social conservatism and economic radicalism. The themes were the importance of attachment to a place, the necessity of a beloved community, opposition to the commercial corporate order, resistance to the dominion of science and machines, the powerful importance of marriage and the procreation of children, the power and beauty of the productive home economy, and communion with God the Creator. He died at a relatively young age in 1947. However, summing up his life, one commentator has said, Raw's forte was the making of homely poetry out of a way of life.
Thank you, Alan. Will?
Charles Grandison Finney was the 19th century's most famous evangelist. Born in Connecticut, gained fame in Western New York, especially its Rochester Revival of 1831, and then to save the country, he moves to Oberlin College in 1835, where he remains the last 40 years of his life as professor of theology and president. The Finney tradition is characterized by intense moralism and great controversy. Especially Scots-Irish Presbyterians hated Finney for his theological innovations and his basically intense moralism. He also clashed with free thought people. When Finney went on vacation, a man by the name of John Ingersoll stepped into his pulpit. His son Robert also was very evangelistic, but in a quite different sense. But what I talk about is the way, essentially, this kind of Midwest moralism and perfectionism, and its division really two ways. In the late 19th century, it splits into, basically part of that tradition becomes the social gospel movement, which is very strong at Oberlin, with Henry Churchill King, later president. And one of the other famous Wisconsin progressives, John R. Commons, whose mother was an Oberlin graduate, and John went to Oberlin as well, and also was an early social gospel pioneer. The other part of that tradition becomes really what we understand as modern American evangelicalism and fundamentalism. A Oberlin College, a sister institution is Wheaton College in Illinois, which of course is associated with Billy Graham. And I end my paper with talking about in 1972, George McGovern showed up at Wheaton College to speak during his presidential election. And he shocked the audience by telling the people there that only poverty had kept him away from Wheaton College. And in fact, and if you heard the McGovern, some of us who are old did, the McGovern nominating speech in 1968 out of the book of Isaiah, you realized you were hearing a very good Methodist preacher. But anyway, my paper basically talks about the spin-off of that evangelical in two different directions.
Thank you. Next is David.
Wow. Well, I'll be long. What I did was a piece on the rise and demise of the Rural Regional Studies program at Southwest State, where I teach. Okay, as a reflection of national trends. The Southwest was founded in 1966. That's part of a whole bunch of things to take care of the baby boom. The initial enrollments were about 3,000. By 1977, they had tanked to 1,500. Get a new president. The new president, John Weefall, decides to invent a program in rural and regional studies to make this school a place that people in southwestern Minnesota would like to send their children to, right? Okay. So the program prospered until the late 20th century, basically because all the students, regardless of their major, had to take 12 credit hours in rural regional studies. That was a university requirement. Biology, sociology, history, English, even physical education, rural studies, right? They were separate from the general studies requirements, but they overlapped. So if you taught an overlapping course, pow, you really packed them in there. 1982, they set up a regional history center funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 1987, there is a Center for Rural and Regional Studies. It hosts conferences, it underwrites research projects, publications, all kinds of stuff. Stuff for teaching in the secondary and primary schools. It adds a Dean of Rural and Regional Studies. It moves into a 3-room center for the Rural and Regional Studies. The budget rises from $3,000 to $142,000. Funded in large part by grants, right? USDA, National Endowment for the Humanities, all kinds of other places. And my co-author, Emily Williamson, and I, we tracked a lot of these. The grants were just going all over the place. Part of them went into, we used to do one thing we called it cornstalk. And that was about every other month. It was like Woodstock, only it was out in the cornfields, right? But then every 3 years we would do one of these Marshall Writers Festivals, all week long, rural writers festivals. And these brought in the big fish. And one of the reviews of that thing, this was in the Star Tribune, it's unlikely that such a stellar group of men and women of letters will ever be gathered in one place in the state again. You know, unbelievable. Did a lot of publications, newspaper columns, but also there was a series for the Society of over 30 books. And then we set up Plains Press, so we did Remembering the Sioux, bringing the humanities to the countryside, a book on the Farm Holiday Association, a good story on Alan Bill Holmes' Music of Failure, picture books if you like photos, right? So a lot of books came out of there. 2005, they were proposing an international center for rural and literary arts with its own building, no less. And a regional hall of fame and annual festivals and K through 12 programs. And the interesting thing is the enrollments popped right back up from that 1,500 to the highest they've ever been with this Rural and Regional Studies program. But we know what was out there, and that was global and diverse, right? And you can see that kind of coming early on, but gradually the focus shifts and the funding shifts, and you just don't get funding. And Norwegian and German and Polish and Icelandic, they don't count as diverse at all, right? And farm kids, they would be the smallest minority at all, but they don't count either, right? So it just doesn't happen here. The Rural Regional Studies requirement dropped to 8 hours, and then it dropped to 3 hours, and in 2006 it disappeared entirely. The other player in this game is a statewide transfer curriculum, which comes down from St. Paul, actually, the center, and they don't give a shit about rural and regional at all, let me tell you. And that overrode the local requirements, so it all kind of falls apart. Joe Amato retired in 2004, and in 2005 they fired all the people who were over there. And the last Marshall Festival was 2010. There were 12 people showed up for the final dinner. They had meals ready for 300, and 12 people show up, and the enrollments tanked again too. Now they're talking about cutting philosophy program entirely, cut the literature program entirely. We can fill, in 2004 we filled 5 sections of rural lit. Now we cannot even fill 1 section of diversity literature. It just plain doesn't work. And they always say, well, this is a national trend, there's nothing we can do about it. And I always say, don't follow the national trend, right? So I don't know, we're getting a new president, we're getting a new provost, we're getting a new chairman of the English department, we're getting a new everybody, maybe they'll figure something out, but.
And we're definitely going to be able to unpack that more in the discussion.
Yeah, we could
Definitely
talk more about that.
Next is Michael.
Okay, so my chapter is entitled An Easterner in the Hinterlands, Horace Kalin, the University of Wisconsin, and the Regional Roots of Cultural Pluralism, 1911 to 1918. So what I'm talking about here is how an Eastern-rooted philosopher spent 7 deeply eventful years in the emerging Midwest, and this is part of a larger work that I'm doing that explores the neglected fact that the idea of cultural pluralism, which is a potent, irrepressible concept that continues to reverberate in the present, was born in and inspired by the Midwest, and more than a century ago, and that between the years 1900 and 1915, this idea emerged. There are many other figures in this story. Horace Kalin is just one of them. They include people like Jane Addams, Hamlin Garland, Frederick Jackson Turner, Ole Rolvog, believe it or not, Waldemar Auger, not many people know about this guy, Reverdy Ransom, black socialist in Chicago, and Ida B. Wells. All of these people were coming up with similar ideas about cultural diversity, and they were inspired by the burgeoning Midwest, which was a region that was alive with change. It was the center of the nation at that point. It was very culturally diverse. It was, the keynote talk we had this morning speaks to this. So here comes this East Coast guy, this poor Jewish kid who pulled himself up by the bootstraps from the slums of Boston, studied with Henry James and William James, and the greatest philosophers of the time, went off to Oxford, had just come back, was expecting to teach in an Ivy League school, and lo and behold, he winds up in Madison. He is annoyed, he's aggravated, he complains about it. Now, the common scholarly narrative about this is that Horace Kalin was miserable, the Midwest was an empty disaster zone for him. He couldn't wait to get home. And it just had no impact on him. Well, my chapter is about how the Midwest had a deep impact on his idea, and without the Midwest, we would not have this idea of cultural pluralism, which is still very much with us. Okay, and I go through his colleagues at Wisconsin that were both friendly allies and also deep antagonists. He had and it was a very rich academic milieu, plus visitors who came. Unfortunately, Emma Goldman came the year before he arrived. I wish that had happened, but Randolph Bourne came, and Max Eastman, and I wish I had been a fly in the wall in Horace Kalin's bachelor pad where those 3 men met and talked. And so that just gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. So the Midwest was absolutely crucial. This idea would not have come about had Horace Kalin not gone to the Midwest. That's kind of a brave proposal, but that's what I write about.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And we'll get into that more in the discussion. Finally, Gleaves, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to say what a privilege it is to be with all of you. I mean, it's just a lot of fun to be with all these high caliber scholars and sharing our ideas. And my contribution, now we're going to swing from the left, now we're going to swing far right here. So,
Well, Calvin was kind of in the middle, actually.
Okay.
Curious
Okay.
situation.
well, the title of my chapter is The Fusionist Mind of Stephen Tonser, because no one is more rooted in the Midwest, I think, than Tonser's career could be for a guy who was pretty cosmopolitan ultimately, but he's from Jerseyville, Illinois. He spends all of his time in his youth there, goes to Carlin Blackburn College in Carlinville, Illinois. He goes off to World War II, comes back, a couple of Fulbrights, gets his PhD at the University of Illinois. There's an Illinois theme of all of us who began, we're talking about Illinois. But then he ends up with his first job at the University of Michigan. He stays there for the next 4 decades, and then he retires there. And his whole life is this struggle between his Midwestern rootedness and this cosmopolitan student of European intellectual history. So it creates quite an interesting tension. He's most famous, if anybody remembers his name nowadays, for his furious denunciation of the neoconservatives who were infiltrating the Republican Party and the conservative movement back in the 1980s. Furious. And there was I begin the chapter with the scene in the Drake Hotel ballroom in 1986 at a Philadelphia Society meeting where he unloads on the neoconservatives. And he's accused of anti-Semitism for that speech. I think that is an error that we could talk about later.
Of course.
But it really kind of taints his reputation for the second half of his career and life from that point forward, 1986. Tonser's work is so much more interesting, though, than what happened within the Republican Party and the internecine battles that are going on within the conservative movement. I think that to understand his place in American thought and in Midwestern thought, you need to look at his mentor, a man named Frank Meyer, who was instrumental in tutoring Tonser right out of his PhD program. Frank Meyer is famous for being a fusionist. He was somebody who was really working hard in the 50s and 60s, all the way up until his deathbed conversion to Roman Catholicism, of synthesizing Roman Catholic and Anglo-Catholic traditionalism on the one hand with sort of a secular libertarianism on the other hand. So it's a fascinating tension that Meyer picks up, and Tonser is very persuaded that this is necessary. Tonser regards himself as a conservative between the crests of the Appalachians and the crests of the Rockies, this heartland conservative. So he's taken with this, but what he does is he adopts the fusionist program of Frank Meyer and he turns it into a civilizational project. And the civilizational project, I argue, ultimately is rooted in the Catholic humanists that he was so attracted to. So you find really him taking up a leadership position within the American conservative movement that would be in the traditionalist wing, but very sympathetic to the fusionists within that wing. So he looked at the Catholic Church and he saw that the church had prevailed against the Roman Empire, the Germanic invasions, the Reformation, and the modern age. And what he thought that his generation was called on to do was to fight a war against modernity and postmodernity, and a really, really fierce war, but one in which he was willing not just to reject modernity and postmodernity outright, but again, apply the fusionist principles. What can you sift, weigh, test? What can you baptize, to use his language, from postmodernity? So I think that the consistent refrain in Stephen Tonser's work is this attempt to reconcile opposites that we see in the fusionist project. He's trying to reconcile the individual with community, the marketplace that's driven by the profit motive with those things, those values that are priceless, community, yes, individual, left, right. Jerusalem and Athens is real big in his thinking. And I think also this Midwestern heartland experience with the demands of his profession as a European intellectual historian to balance the the cosmopolitan European and coastal American mind among the elites with this Midwestern mind. So I find him a fascinating figure, and will continue to do some work on him. He had a very tumultuous inner life. I've done research on him all in archives all over the United States, and he's a fascinating figure.
Awesome. And we will definitely unpack that as we go forward with the discussion. Thank you all very much for your introductions. I really appreciate it. And they've really helped us sort of set the table for what we're going to do now, which is sort of our guided discussion. So I've developed these questions as a loose map for today. While I've directed specific questions to specific panelists based on their respective research chapters, any panelist should feel free to contribute to the discussion. So one of the interesting threads of research among some of the chapters highlighted today is the impact of Midwestern culture and ideas in universities. This is going to be for David and for Michael and for Gleaves, but please feel free to include yourself in any of this. What have you discovered in your research that sort of unpacks Midwestern intellectual life in colleges and universities, either its influence on the subject you've researched or maybe some general threads or trends or sort of overarching ideas that you've seen in Midwestern universities that sort of maybe connect your different research threads? So we can start with whoever wants to go first.
Well, I think one of the things that we were finding out was what Gleaves was talking about, is that there are all kinds of diversities. You know, just within our neighborhood, there's the Danish town over here, there's the Icelandic town over here, and there are all those tensions, the same tensions you find and the same mixtures you find, and we've been through this stuff before, and that's what our kind of research showed, I think, and definitely a strong leftist tradition out there in the farmers, right? That's what I would say.
Speaking about the academic environment that Horace
Yeah.
Fallon found, he went there just kind of annoyed and pissed off, and I should be in an Ivy League school, but very rapidly he found himself in the midst of I don't know, it's kind of cliche to say an intellectual hotbed, but Wisconsin was, as one of his mentors said, one of the rising universities in the Midwest, if not nationally. And they weren't just trying to, Horace, get away from us. They really meant it. And so there were faculty members there that were really remarkable. He found a Jewish connection there with Joseph Jastrow, a very famous psychologist, Selig Perlman, a labor historian and socialist who, Callan knew. I have to cut this quick, but Max Otto became his closest friend, another young philosopher who had a lifelong career at Wisconsin and became revered. So, and there were others. I told you about the visitors, Bourne, Eastman. I really wish Emma Goldman had been there for him to meet. A guy named Alfred Zimmern, who later won the Nobel Prize, I believe, as a pacifist, came in. So it was a very stimulating place. And so those are the positive colleagues. But on the other hand, if this is okay, I can.
Absolutely.
The
please.
negative, he had colleagues who pissed him off. It just irked him. And that was also a stimulus. And one of them, John Commons, let me do the big four evil, I shouldn't say this, but we're in the middle of a discussion.
You could say that, right?
President Charles Van Hise, he walks on water at Madison. There's a hall named after him, right? Callan, I could go on here, but Callan, a month into his tenure at Wisconsin, was invited to a Sunday afternoon lecture when people were giving talks. And the first three went pretty well. The fourth one, someone got up and talked about the irrepressible inferiority of the Negro and that they should go back to Africa. They were indelibly savage, and all the other races were fine. President of the University, Van Hise, gave that talk. And Callan was appalled. And this is a journal that only a few people have read. So, so he was, and of course Callan was guilty of, he wasn't perfect, but he was annoyed about that. Then two of these great progressives, quasi-socialists, turned, Richard T. Ely and John R. Commons, as the war developed, became ardent 100% Americanizers and just vicious, attacking anybody who question the war. And worst of all was Edward Ellsworth Ross, A.E. Ross, who was a vicious, racist sociologist. And their work really was a catalyst for Callan. And he had an office near theirs, and I wish I could find actual interactions between them, but that's what got him, what was the catalyst for his articles in Nation magazine, 1915, A.E. Ross's book about the inherent inferiority of these immigrants that are swarming our shores, and especially Jews. He had amazing, terrible things to say about Jewish immigrants, and of course Callan being Jewish. So that just gives you a sense of the kind of intellectual milieu that he found himself in.
I have a quick
at
follow-up
Madison.
question for you.
Yeah.
So these sort of faculty members, these people who are part of this university,
Right.
that he really had a huge problem with,
Right.
were they also on the political left, or were they progressives?
That's a really good question.
Okay.
Ely and Commons were on the left in their youth and middle age, and then the war comes along, and they were leading. I mean, they were basically saying, "Let's go out and tar and feather these Germans."
Robert LaFollette was censored
Yes.
by the university.
Vote was 402 to 2, I
Yeah.
believe, and Callan and his friend, his philosopher friend I mentioned, were the only two to vote against it. So yeah, so I don't know.
Wow, because
Yeah.
that's one thing that I always
So
find
the
very
war.
interesting as I've been sort of doing research on sort of free thought secularism and how it moves into the progressive era, particularly with someone like Clarence Darrow, because like Clarence Darrow, obviously, he to me is in many ways like the heir apparent to Robert Ingersoll. They're both attorneys, they're both Illinoisans, they're both agnostics, they both have a very similar worldview, but where there was some sort of very big shortcomings with Darrow was his views about eugenics, particularly when it came to people who were either developmentally or physically disabled. Now, basically what he argued for was very much in the same way what the ethicist Peter Singer argues for today, which is sort of a humane utilitarianism about if someone is physically disabled or intellectually disabled and they don't have a high quality of life and they're in pain and suffering, maybe it's best to end their life peacefully. Now, Darrow basically said the same thing, but he didn't say it that way. He said it the way Clarence Darrow says things. So it didn't sound very, very good. But there's that tension, right? Within that sort of the left politics as you get into the early decades of the 20th century, where you have this sort of dedication to sort of equality and egalitarianism, but on the other hand, you do have these elements of sort of eugenics and racism and anti-Semitism and how those percolate up. So that's kind of why I was wanting to do that follow-up question, because to me that is that contradiction that exists within the progressive period that is, I think, important and something that I think obviously lends itself to good study.
Commons also had a son who was in the military.
Excuse me?
Commons had a son who was in the military.
Was he in the military?
Yeah. Commons had a son who was.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
And so you also wonder how these kinds of dynamics. And of course, I mean, one of the amazing things in Wisconsin, like when in the Prohibition vote in the Senate, 10 of the 12 Wisconsin congressmen actually vote for Prohibition. And those of us from Wisconsin find this pretty amazing.
Where was the beer money?
Yeah, wow.
Well, of course, my grandfather made his own, but
This is interesting because Stephen Thompson almost made it a hobby of picking up people who had been communists, in their youth, back, say, in the 30s and up until World War II, when the last Stalinists gave up, But he made it a hobby of picking these people up. They were often very eager to learn more about Catholicism and the Catholic humanist civilizational mission, which gave them an analogous mission to Bolshevism.
Yeah.
And so they adopted it. And for example, Frank Meyer, who was converted on his deathbed, Stephen certainly took credit for that.
Relative to Horace Kalin, identifying him on the ideological spectrum really is difficult, and I'm not sure if his basic view was that ethnicity was not changeable. You were a German. You were born a German. You're always going to be a German. That cannot change. If you're born Jewish, you're Jewish. You're always going to be Jewish. That cannot change. And it goes on maybe sometime, centuries down the road, there will be some coming together, but his view was of very distinct ethnic groups that could not change. And
he shifted
over time, I'm thinking of the earliest
no,
one,
they
his
said that about the
1915, 16 essays, yeah.
Yeah, you can't change your grandfather, you can change everything else.
Is that being revived today?
Well, in a way it is.
I think,
but
yeah,
is it
identity politics?
But do you call it conservative or do you call it liberal? And in an odd sort of way, it's kind of reactionary. That is, you can't change. But in another way, it's multicultural and on steroids.
Yeah, but of course the word multicultural is different from cultural pluralism, and he differed from toward the end of his life. He was aware of the beginnings of multiculturalism. But he would say that we should, that every culture is equally valid and we should be, he wasn't making a hierarchy, but he wasn't flawless in that. He got a little upset with Catholics and Irish at certain points. And of course, African Americans. This is the ghost of the banquet for Callan. And in a later chapter, he embraced, in many ways, black culture. And it has to do with his long-term friendship with Elaine Locke that began at Harvard. And that's a very interesting story that weaves its way from 1907 to Locke's death in 1956. So by the 50s, Callan had come around and was embracing, black culture in many ways. And some of these letters, 99 boxes of letters and manuscripts. It's amazing. I live right near the Hebrew Union, the Jewish Archives, Reformed College Archives. So that's been, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but he would constantly come back to the same idea every 15 or 20 years and revise it, and he did by the 1950s, and I give him credit for that.
We definitely have that discussion in many ways today with sort of the rise of the phrase that people have used a lot. And Francis Fukuyama has written about this, and Amy Chu has written about this, is the idea of identity politics. And that there are different forms of identity politics. There are ones that are sort of more inclusive, and then that sort of are, I just recently finished Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It sort of ties into universities. And he sort of talks about, in their book, they sort of talk about how they embrace what they call common humanity identity politics, which is sort of rooted in many of the ideas that would come out of sort of the Christian humanist tradition, people like Dr. Martin Luther King. And what they were more worried about was what they called common enemy identity politics, where it's very much an us versus them. Life is a battle between good people and evil people, and we are the good people and you are the evil people, and that kind of idea. And so, this is this is important because we see these things playing out on college campuses now, and and so the hope, I think, is that through learning about how colleges have evolved with these ideas, that perhaps we can adopt a more sort of humanistic common humanity form of identity politics that embraces that pluralism without sort of denigrating one group at the expense of the other.
I think Callan would absolutely agree with you on that.
Could I comment on this?
Please.
Since Tonsor regarded himself self-consciously as a Catholic humanist, and
Please.
he distinguished between Christian humanism up to the Reformation, and then he would have believed that once the Reformation, some Reformation thinkers attacked reason, and so the idea of being a Protestant Christian humanism was sort of an oxymoron for some parts. I mean, didn't Martin Luther, for example, call reason a whore?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reason is the devil's harlot, yeah.
But Stephen Tonsor was accused of anti-Semitism after his attack on the neocons. This is very interesting. If you look at all the literature that appeared after the Drake Hotel speech, it was thought that he really was kind of a fraud because he wasn't really trying to establish common ground with others. But what is overlooked in that is a very interesting anecdote from his early life. He, as a freshman in Carlinville, Illinois, at Blackburn College, fell in love with a Jewish refugee from Germany. This would have been 1939, 1940. Her name was Rose Epstein, and her father, Fritz, of course, became famous at Harvard. His son, Rose's brother, Klaus Epstein, also became a famous scholar. Tonsor desperately wanted to marry this woman. He kept going back to Boston every chance he could get. And her father, it turned out, the Jewish father, actually did not want his daughter to marry a Catholic. So, I mean, he was the one putting the brakes on it in that case. But it goes to show that Tonsor, this Catholic humanist conception, did include a larger, he was attacking the neocons, in other words, for their political stance, for getting us into wars for which there was no conclusion, as opposed to their ethnic identity.
Well, and I imagine that if I'm sort of assuming, but like I'm assuming his criticisms may have been of some of Irving Kristol's work.
Yes, precisely.
So that leads into that same
Yes.
discussion. Okay.
Norman Podhoretz,
Okay.
Crystal, Midge Decter.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That's kind of what I thought.
Yep.
And that's very easy for that to go from
Right.
criticizing the ideas of sort of
Yes.
of a more expanded American militarism versus anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism.
That
That's
absolutely
right.
makes sense.
Yep.
And so we'll move on to the next question, which is a little bit about my chapter as well as Bill and Alan's, and I guess yours as well. And so we can kind of discuss the impact of religion on the intellectual history of the Midwest. What do the various religious identities of our research subjects tell us about Midwestern intellectual life and identity? So anybody can start first.
Catholicism in America, also to some degree in Europe, was going through an intellectual renewal and revival in the first half of the 20th century. The Thomistic revival was pumping along. And for the first time, Roman Catholics in the United States were not just concerned about protecting their own people, their own faith, but saw that they had actually the confidence finally to say, we have answers for the whole of society. And they were ready for the first time to move into American cultural and intellectual debates with the message that we have the answer to the failures of just about everything, of capitalism, the failures of liberalism, the failures that were quite evident, say, about the 1930s in particular. But even within that context, in the United States, there were differences. There was a struggle going on, informal obviously, between the East Coast Catholics, who were mainly Irish, and the growing German Catholic population in the Middle West. It even went to the point where the Archbishop Mundelein, the Archbishop of Chicago, had a plan basically to make Chicago the Catholic capital of America, not Boston, and or New York. And John Roth fit into that to a considerable degree. The Jesuits also were feeling their oats. 1931, the papal encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, the second great social encyclical came along. It was subtitle was On Reconstruction of the Social Order. This was not a modest document. This was the Catholic plan to reorder the whole of society and the whole of the economy. And it had been drafted actually by Jesuits in Europe. It was very much a Jesuit project, and Raw became the rural life expert for the Jesuit project in reconstructing American social life. In 1940, the Jesuits finally started, after years of fussing about it, they set up the Institute for Social Order in New York City, which was going to be their way of transforming America into a Christian order. The project didn't work very well. Raw went out, he was there for 6 months, and his anti-urbanism and his ruralism just did not fly very well. And it was a pretty good example that Midwestern social reformist agrarianism worked pretty well out there, but it just wasn't going to quite fly in New York. He left after 6 months, went back to Nebraska. But these currents were going on, and again, the distinctive Midwestern accent was the agrarian one. It was this view that the East Coast was tired and Irish. The German Catholics were opening up a whole new vista of opportunities in the Middle West. And again, Raw was part of that.
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
One of the real characteristics of Oberlin was what's called Oberlin perfectionism, which was a version of basically of Finney reading a few Methodists and other Oberlin leaders, and basically Christian perfection is the idea that you can be perfect on earth. And lots of the Oberlin theology is really oriented toward life this side of death. And Finney's basic, and this led to, of course, divisions with the more classic Calvinists. And from the very beginning, Oberlin was very controversial. And it was an interracial, of course, and also, it had women students. And one of the things that happens is, of course, this becomes really the national educational model eventually. But it takes a long time for the Ivy Leaguers to catch up to this thing, of course, being slower in Eastern. But this moralism, I think, is one of the characteristics of Midwest culture. And it's a moralism of both the right and the left. And one of the things that helps it in the Midwest is that late in the century, the Scandinavian immigrants who tend to be pietist in orientation share lots with these Midwesterners. And it is, it's, and so occasionally when you see discussions of prohibition, you'll often see discussions of immigrants versus everyone else. Well, of course, a good portion of the Scandinavian immigrants were very enthusiastic about prohibition. And especially Finns, but also Norwegians, and it's this intense moralism that plays out also for example, in Minnesota during World War II, the big move for integration, which is statewide, supported in both New York and Minnesota, passed these laws in the 1940s, and of course Hubert Humphrey, who really fits into this pattern. Before Jimmy Carter, he was the famous Sunday school teaching Methodist, and in fact, one of the big Humphrey challenges in Minnesota was to shed this image of racism that the Democrats lived with, and this is why the 1948 Humphrey speech is so significant at the Democratic National Convention, and this is tied to a very specific Midwestern kind of moralism.
Just quick,
Yeah.
it's ironic though that Carrie McWilliams, someone I admire, wrote a whole book about anti-Semitism in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And so it was pretty rampant in the Twin Cities
Right.
in the 1940s.
Right. This is true.
Yeah, but in the hinterlands, apparently it wasn't as strong. I just talked to somebody here about this.
My experience is, of course, there were lots of Jewish, especially scrap metal dealers, like Ann Landers, the Phillips family in Eau Claire, and she was involved in Democratic politics in the late 40s and early 50s in Eau Claire before she moved to Chicago. And basically, all of these towns had business people that were really significant Jewish business people. I always tell that one of my dad's stories was my grandfather would refuse, being a good Czech, would refuse to shop at any Jewish businesses. And so one day my dad asked him why, and he said, well, if you have a name like ours, people might think you're Jewish.
The same issue.
Yeah.
But I'd be proud that I'm not.
But my dad's comment was how these things that didn't make any sense.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And sort of to piggyback off of your talking about moralism, that was a very key component to both Ingersoll and to Moody. It was one of the things that's very interesting is I found a newspaper that sums up my whole chapter in like 2 sentences, and it's perfect. And it's from the Fond du Lac Reporter, which is in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it says something along the lines of like, Robert Ingersoll thinks Dwight Moody's a good man, but his ideas are old. Dwight Moody thinks that Robert Ingersoll is a good man, but his ideas are bad. They're a lot more similar than they are different.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they were. Because if you looked at their political ideas, both of them very solidly fit into the individualistic classical liberal tradition, but in a very different way. So with Ingersoll, that classical liberal tradition is more tied with Thomas Paine and Voltaire and David Hume and Adam Smith and sort of the more rationalist culture, whereas Moody's is definitely way more rooted in what is called supernatural rationalism, which comes out of the sort of New England tradition. And both of them have this very interesting interplay in their work, where both of them believe, either from a secular point of view or from a Christian worldview, that if one is sufficiently dedicated to sort of personal excellence, that one can improve your life. Like that's, Moody wrote one of his most famous sermons was one called Sowing and Reaping. Basically, his whole idea is what you reap is what you sow. If you put in to life as much as you'll get out as much as you put in. And that's sort of the way of the path of righteousness. And so Ingersoll writes back and says, well, I thought the whole point of being saved is you're saved because you accept Christ. What's this whole good works bit? And so kind of like criticizes him for that. But they're absolutely fascinating characters, and I'll leave this part of the discussion with one final little story that's apocryphal, but it's in one of the Moody biographies, where Moody is at a train station. He sees a young boy selling these little newspaper pamphlets, and back then they were the social media of their time. These little 5-10 cent pamphlets on whatever topics or subjects. Oftentimes they'd be republications of newspaper columns, and this little boy was selling one of Ingersoll's, which was a lecture on hell, and sort of Ingersoll's condemnation of the concept of hell. And so he's like, Ingersoll on hell, Ingersoll on hell. And Moody reportedly goes up to this young child and says, my dear boy, if you're going to sell that, would you please sell mine? And so he gives him a stack, and he says, Ingersoll on hell, Moody on heaven. And it turns out both of those lectures are real, and they were written within 2 years of each other. And so I wrote about them in my chapter, and sort of that interplay of rational individualism that they both share. So even though, and they both die within 6 months of each other, which is absolutely fascinating too. So these are guys who are immensely important to understanding those twin visions of modernity that are happening in America, this rise of religious diversity, while at the same time you have the golden age of free thought. So it's a very interesting interplay, and it all happens because of their time in Illinois and because of their influences in the Midwest. We're finally going to get Ray involved in this discussion. I feel bad. We're going to end our little guided discussion on politics. This question is for Ray. This is also for Alan and anybody else, obviously Gleaves. Tell us about the diversity of political ideas in the Midwest and how they've impacted the country as a whole based on what you've seen in your research.
Well, in doing my research, I've come to realize how important Adlai Stevenson's 2 campaigns for the presidency were in kind of being a minor league of sorts, or a training ground for future Democratic administration, particularly John Kennedy's administration. You had both, John Barlow Martin, you had Newton Minow, who was very important in Stevenson's life, and the fact that perhaps today we should be taking a closer look at who are involved in presidential campaign, the staff members, because they're going to play an important role later on if that candidate is successful or if they go on to other administrations. Mm-hmm. And Minow's a big part of that. And I'm also always impressed by the fact that he could be so bold in what he's saying to these broadcasters, because 1, he wasn't interested in being reappointed, 2, and he wasn't looking for a job in broadcasting after he left office. So maybe that's a good guideline for future administration officials to follow. They might have less problems in government. Yeah. And both Martin and Minow also saw government as doing good for the American people. That they saw it as a force for doing positive things for the American public. And I think they got that through their work with the Stevenson campaign. And also what happened to them in their childhoods and the effect of the FDR's programs, the immediate effect, particularly for Martin, FDR's New Deal programs got his father a job after he lost his business, and also saved their home from being foreclosed on. So that was a big impact on what he did later on in government.
Okay, very neat.
You mentioned my name. I'll just throw out a couple of things. In some ways, Midwestern agrarian revival was sort of crushed, intellectually at least, by World War II. The desire to rebuild an agrarian society dominated by farming, decentralized economically and politically, was crushed by what we call the greatest centralizing event in human history. And on the one hand, it looked as though they failed. I mean, the depopulation of the countryside began during World War II. Up until that point, there were still 30 million people residing on American farms, which was the high point. It had increased much during the 30s, but it had not declined either. But it fell very sharply starting in the war. And the farming population today is no more than 4 or 5 million. On the one hand, so it looks as though there was a complete and absolute failure. But in another way, there wasn't, particularly when you look at the politics. I'm thinking of Minnesota in particular here. It's still the Democratic Farmer Labor Party up there. And it's kind of I think it's something more than an historical residue. There still is some. I mean, Eugene McCarthy was a great example. There's Wellstone. I mean,
rural landscape.
there's still, particularly in Minnesota, to some degree in Wisconsin, some degree in Iowa, there's still a remnant, at least, of I think that spirit is still there. It tends to be more the Democratic Party side for a whole lot of historical reasons. But that's there. Another legacy of the Catholic agrarians in particular, has been they developed John Raw in particular, developed a distinctive environmental ethic that hasn't been enough attention paid to it. The Catholic agrarians did not view beautiful wilderness places as sacred, but they did view work in rural places, work in the countryside, work outdoors as sacramental. And they had a view of respect for what we call the environmental ethic, which had to do with cycles. That is, they relished following the cycles of a year, of the planting of the seed, the tending of the plants, the harvest, the dormant time during the winter. And that sense of cycles, again, very different from the dominant sort of the John Muir sort of environmentalism, which was the mountains are sacred, the woods are sacred, don't touch them, don't. This was much more of an anthropocentric form of environmentalism, which entirely consistent, I think, with Christianity, and again, I think deserves far more attention than it's got.
Well, there was a bump too in the late 70s and 80s with the Wendell Berry and those kind of people. And these guys are on the staff of the New Yorker, for crying out loud. Yeah. Garrison Keillor, Wendell Berry.
Edward Abbey.
Ed Abbey, right? And I at that point, I had not been writing about rural stuff. I did Book of Generation in Motion and writing since I had a New York editor. And he comes, I want to do my next book on Phil Oakes, and he says, "No, David, rural. America is interested in rural."
What? Really?
This is a New York editor, so that became Late Harvest, and it got plagiarized and everything else. But there was that bump in the 70s and 80s.
Farm movies, Saving the Farm.
Farm movies,
Farm Aid,
everything was going on in
that
there.
was the 90s,
But
80s,
that
90s, but
fell apart
where
too.
did it go?
And we're seeing a little bit of that again.
There might
just
be
a
an
little
echo,
bit.
yeah.
And I would say, in some ways, if you look at, particularly in this discussion of tariffs and farmers, but the other thing is, like, if you think of a lot of these memoirs that come out, like Hillbilly Elegy and other ones, where you're thinking about, the ways in which, because I'm thinking not just as agrarianism, but also just white working class, right? And how, I think a big portion of the reason why Trump won is because of that white working class that felt a certain level of resentment of political elites that sort of ignored them. I'm not going to discount the racism or the bigotry or any of that, but I do feel like they sort of see this sort of the neoliberalism sort of the both of the parties, and they're like, well, they're not really that different, and they don't care about me. So it's like, that's, I think, uniquely Midwestern, and that's why that understanding the dynamics of that is so important, because then it will help, at least for me, in my opinion, reinvigorate a politics that's rooted in actual, in my opinion, positive humanistic populism that's rooted in actual working people issues, instead of just paying lip service to them.
David, I'd like to hear more about your experiment at your school. I mean, just my question is, it sounded like it was really working well, even into the early 2000s. And I understand. There's no I believe, I'm sorry to say this. There's no idiocy that a college administrator can make that would ever surprise me. But in this case, it sounds really amazing. They had a going thing, and which made them distinctive.
turn that camera off. I think part of it was internal politics, and when Joe retired, he tried to pass it along to his son, who was not really all that
This
good.
is your colleague?
Yeah, he was the dean of rural studies.
Oh, really?
But there was also, I mean, there had been, you know, there was a global awareness at Southwest State, and they got dorms like Kama Sutra and all these kind of stuff, hippies. But within the history department and literature program too, there was this kind of an attack. And actually, Joe and I are to blame too, because Joe is off writing books about my three Sicilies, and I'm off over in Poland, writing Poland in transition. I brought that book, and somebody walked off with it. I don't know where that's. So we're going overseas too, and Bill Holm is off in Iceland a lot of the time. And we didn't pay enough attention. So I think part of it was politics, but part of it was just this resurgence of, you know, the wave and the counter wave that, and I don't know, but the program just tanked. But also part of it is grant
It didn't have
funding.
any effect at any other institution?
Well, Augustana seems to still have a pretty
Augustana?
good, yeah, August
Really?
is doing very well,
They have a
right?
rural studies program?
Well, they got Augie's got all kinds of stuff,
Some
right?
kind of regional, Midwest or Great Plains.
They have the
Great
Yeah.
Plains Center, right, yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, those
yeah,
are-
Michael Mullen is here at this conference, not really
Yeah.
a person yesterday.
yeah.
You know, there's this thing called local and global, you know? the
Local,
local,
yeah.
global, the microcosm, they're linked. You know, the nation state is kind of a fuzzy thing in between, but you gotta know both.
Did you
I mean,
say
you could-
local?
Local. But you could, you know, maybe you could sell that.
Well, it helps if your feet are balanced. I mean, one foot is
No,
here,
you
the
gotta,
other foot's off over there.
I really
That's
believe
what we're
this. You
talking
gotta know
about.
where you're.
It's the dynamic
Or sort of a
tension.
reconfiguration of the Tip O'Neill line, like all knowledge is
Exactly.
local.
There you go. But you know, you gotta know where you stand, even though you don't have to stay there all your life.
All your life.
Yeah.
And I
but
figure
then
you understand who you are by bumping into what you're not, right? So you got to go out and look around,
course,
and then you
but
say,
you
"Oh,
come
that's not
back."
me." But then you come back. But I don't know. So we'll see what happens. But
maybe there's-
so part of the collapse of the program is political, and also you just don't get grants for local, rural, regional stuff anymore. It's all.
Do you remember there was this movement to decentralize the NEH?
Yeah,
They're
I
gonna make
remember that one.
regional centers. And who's the charismatic Mississippian who ran the NEH?
Bill Ferris.
Bill Ferris, yeah. And I got in touch with me and other people about regional NEH centers, and that went about the same time.
Right.
Yeah. Bummer.
Well, it's too bad because, of course, Tonser's way of thinking of the demise was pretty rapid, and then, of course, Joe Amato, whom you've been referencing, was
Yeah.
Tonser's student
Oh,
back
he
in
was a student?
the 50s.
Really?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
Early 60s.
I'm interested, I want to hear just a little bit more about how Tonser's sort of idea of fusionism or fusionist ideas, how you think they could impact or do still continue to impact politics today, and what ways they could leave a real good positive influence.
Well, I like your question. We did not choreograph this question beforehand, but it kind of plays right into one of the things we do. Not only do we host at the Hauenstein Center this wonderful conference, you know, we've had, you know, a lot of great involvement from John Miller and John Lauk and so many other people over the years, the last 5 years. But at the same time, we've been initiating this Common Ground initiative over the last, since 2012. It started with an NEH grant. And I've thought a lot about Tonser's work as sort of an intellectual substructure for this fusionist project. And I've developed a typology that I teach the students in our Cook Leadership Academy, where we talk about the cognitive or the intellectual ways of achieving common ground. They're techniques that you can use, and they're emotional techniques are really powerful. Robert Quinn's work, Building the Bridges as We're Walking on Them, where he teaches people how to give their core story. So you and I, for example, you know, maybe we would pair off as not being similar at all, but you would tell a core story of yours, of how you really identify. I would share with you, and we'd go through 3 rounds of that, and then the last session is then we'd start making all the connections we have that we had not discovered. So, you know, if you're a conservative, I'm a progressive, you know, you're you're white and I'm black, or whatever it is, all of a sudden we realize we're human. So, there are intellectual, there are emotional, there are ethical ways of achieving common ground that transcend all this. Spiritual ways, I would argue that Christian Catholic humanism is a vision that, because of its fusionist project, Christian humanism is ultimately rooted in a worldwide movement that goes back to the first millennium BC, is the axial age, what Karl Jaspers called the axial age. And you're seeing yin and yang develop in Chinese culture. You see the veil of Maya developing in the Vedic, the Indian culture. You see in Jewish culture coming along, you see Genesis lays out all of the polarities right there. And Christian humanism picks up these. It's not an isolated movement. And it understands that we live in the dynamic tension. We are neither, totally angelic, and we're not totally bestial. We're in the dynamic tension, and it is given to us as human beings to mediate in the tension. And I use it, the analogy of the force field, that if you have the polarity of a positive and negative, the field in between the positive and negative is a powerful force. You just can't see it. And so what is that powerful force for the Christian humanists? It's the disciplines that have developed to try to describe this invisible thing. It's theology, philosophy, history, literature. All of those come to bear in sort of that cultural texture that we don't see. We don't see it so often, obviously. But that's the work we do. How do we bring all of that together to show people there really are ways to relate that are very powerful? But we've got to get beyond the damn politics to do it.
I totally agree. I mean, one of the big challenges, I identify as a secular humanist. I was involved in sort of the broader atheist secular movement for many, many years, and I left it precisely because of this problem. It's extremely, I think it's extremely hostile to people who aren't like them. I think it's incredibly condescending and patronizing and pretentious. And I found that when I sort of left that community and went on sort of an intellectual journey of my own, that I found that, engaging in that synthesis, right, and finding ways of which I just did not identify with that solidly anymore. And so finding common ground is incredibly important to me as a project, and I think it's part of what, this amazing panel today has been about, is trying to find the common threads and these common ideas that connect Midwestern intellectual history. And I just want to thank you all very much for this panel. This has been great. We're now going to open it up for questions. Please keep your questions brief and make sure they are questions. We want to get in as many as we can, so I'll kind of rubberneck and see who has a question. Yes.
First, hello, everybody. I'm actually from your publisher. So I'm with the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, so it's wonderful to hear all of the panelists and hear more about your chapters. The book is actually in hand with its editor. It's not me, it's another person, and we're excited about the book, and it is coming out next fall. There's been some questions about that, but now you will know. So my question is, I'm wondering if you could link some of the intellectual strains that you've been talking about with the civic mindedness that I think is really kind of a key characteristic of the Midwest. The fact that people go and vote, that they volunteer for wars. It seems to me that it could maybe draw from that question of civility. So how does civility and civic mindedness come together through these intellectual pathways that you've been talking about? In other words, how do these ideas trickle down into the population, into the ways that everyday people think and act and what they believe in, rather than just keeping it in the minds of these interesting men you've been talking about? How do those ideas get out, and how do they become part of the air that we breathe as Midwesterners?
I'll go first. I'll sort of talk about Ingersoll specifically. One of the most foundational parts of his life was his service in the Civil War. He served in the Illinois Cavalry from 1861 to about 1863. He was a prisoner of war. He fought in the Battle of Shiloh. And it really shaped his political and philosophical ideas, specifically on the nature of war itself. He gave this great speech called the Masters of War speech, which he actually gave in Indianapolis in 1868, sort of talking about it. And one of the common threads that goes through all of his work, whether it's the work where he's talking about religion, or if he's talking about politics, or if he's talking even about William Shakespeare, is this idea of citizenship and sort of showing up and being a part of life. And he very much believed in that and lived that himself. He was personal friends with 3 presidents. His brother was a congressman for many, many years. He was he campaigned for every Republican presidential candidate between Grant and McKinley, and was very, very well respected, which allowed him to be able to sort of get away with the more non-religious stuff because people loved him so much about the politics. So they were like, we don't agree with him about religion, but we really like his politics. And so that's, I think, one of the big threads is finding that sense of, I think, the lesson from Ingersoll, which is to lead with ideas that you can connect with other people, that can then inspire other people to become more involved. And then you use that as a window to talk about things specifically that you care about that may not everyone may care about, but then you can maybe find common ground with them. But I always say, make the tent very big, and then sort of make little sections in the tent as you go along. And so that's kind of what I would say is kind of applying to that sort of civic culture.
If I could add a little bit, I hope this answers your question, but I'm thinking of, I guess, more broadly of civic institutions that are built up. Roman Catholicism, just being one example, is true of other faith groups too. But they came as immigrants to the United States, to America, and for several decades, a number of decades, scrimped and saved. The money was raised to build a whole set of institutions. We're talking a whole parochial school system, but also a series of universities and colleges, a series of hospitals, the list goes on and on. Money was scrimped and saved. These were not rich people that came here by and large. They were very poor people, but they built institutions. And what, as a historian, what seemed to, I think, happen, particularly with Roman Catholicism, I'm not a Catholic, so I should state that. I'm looking at it again from the outside. But between about 1900 and, let's say, 1970s, there was a confidence to the faith, and all of these institutions were working well together, both to reinforce the tradition, but also to help integrate Roman Catholics into the broader American context. Part of the virtue of John Raw and his colleagues was they translated European agrarian thought into American. They instead of looking back to the 13th century as the greatest of centuries and as the model for the future of America, they took the same ideas of Thomas Aquinas and turned them into American language. As one writer put it, Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Aquinas spoke with the same voice. Well, that's a huge statement, for heaven's sakes. That's a vast philosophical chasm, but in a lot of ways it worked, and it helped. How do I say? Help normalize Catholicism in the American context. It changed what it meant to be an American in another way as well. It enriched the civic culture. It built a series of institutions which certainly were at least working as they were supposed to. I'd say really up until probably to the 70s when Catholicism had a different set of crises. But again, in terms of building a civil society and a civic society, but also of bringing Catholicism into the American story in a very real way, in a very strong way, I think made a big difference.
I'd love to hear more, by the way, Alan, about what happened in the late 60s on to make it all start to, just unravel. So.
Well, that's another story someday, but Pope Benedict recently wrote some nice little essay on what happened.
The sexual revolution. Yeah. Birth control pills.
More than that.
It's different than Catholic, than Dorothy Day's famous comment, I'm an American, I'm a Roman Catholic.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
First, I think this would be a terrific book, so I'm sure everybody will want to purchase it. And I've been trying to think about, the Midwestern angle as you all talk, because it's so very different. And I guess my question to you is, after an hour of discussion, is it the case that the Midwest has its share of interesting figures who gain national significance? Maybe they pass through the Midwest, or maybe they're from the Midwest, and that's that. Or is there something distinctive about the Midwest that allows for pretty interesting ideas to come forward, either in the particular era of the progressive era or not? And because it seems like some of you have some pretty heterodox mixtures, and particularly along the lines of a kind of a radical conservative mix that is pretty unusual. And I don't want to say there's only radical conservatives in the Midwest, obviously that's not true, but I mean, you have some pretty good examples, either kind of a social progressivism with a cultural conservatism, or maybe a kind of, maybe the opposite kind of mix. But I mean, I don't know that I'm not sure that the Midwest is productive of that in a way. I mean, I do think the Midwest is a new, fresh, changing, dynamic place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that allows great institutions to grow up, like the University of Chicago, which is incredibly fertile. But maybe University of Wisconsin and maybe some of these other places too that have, not quite as prominent. But I wondered, if your thoughts about that, if you brought some coming in, or if they developed, given that it's mapping in the minds of the Midwest and focused on intellectual life in the Midwest.
Well, for example, in the morning panel, one of the points that I wanted to make was that the Midwest, really, if you look at it as the old Northwest, Paul, this was the new republic. And so all of that mashup of ideas from the colonial era and from the founding, and that crucible of violence and thought about republicanism and the contradictory nature of having the Declaration of Independence talking about freedom and yet the existence of slavery. When basically the Jeffersonians, the Hamiltonians, and the Adamsians got together with their three different visions of what a republic, the new republic, should be, they brought that into the Midwest and they tried to refine it. And I think you hit on it, actually. That there was something about this environment and the sense of possibility of what a large republic could be that was so exciting and tempting, and it made for a real fertile combination of both respecting the traditions, again, we're going back to the tensions, respecting the traditions and embracing innovation. And the Midwesterners lived beautifully within that tension and created one of the greatest civilizations ever.
Whoa.
No, seriously. Seriously.
It was an incredibly dynamic place from
diverse.
Like 1900 when
Earlier,
yeah, 1890.
Going all the way back to 1800.
That really, okay.
1800, with Ohio.
Minnesota, 1880.
Where else in the world did you have a relative? I mean, I'm talking about the upper Midwest. So when the Civil War breaks out, it's pretty unified, except for those southern counties in Ohio and Indiana and that kind of thing. But for the most part, peace-loving, institution-building, they made it work.
There's also a belief that you can make the world new.
Yeah, the new republic.
And the perfectionist tradition is real. The Oberlin stuff is just because we have never had women students doesn't mean we shouldn't have them now. Or that these boundaries that separate people, the belief that they are artificial human boundaries, and part of that is the American belief in the New World. But that takes, I always argue that one of the crucial things is the migration of the Puritan New Englanders west to places like upstate New York, the third New England of lower Michigan, the northern Illinois here, and that these people, they invent feminism as a mass movement. I mean, there were individual figures before that, but the thought that this would be a mass movement that ordinary women would lead is kind of,
Wasn't one of the points of our basic point of the keynote speaker this morning, which I thought was wonderful, is that it's really largely a myth that we're now a dead, dull place that's no longer vibrant and full of life, and it's continued. And this myth must serve some function in the national culture, this myth of the flyover, moo cow Midwest, which is not true. I mean,
and innovation in things like agriculture,
right?
Is just sort of is remarkable.
So, yeah,
Go.
if you have something. Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, we're talking about what's unique in the Midwest, and like a lot of you have emphasized like the ruralism, but how do you address like urban spaces in the Midwest? So like Callan at UW-Madison, is he contacting the ruralism? Like,
No, what Callan did is he was an urban guy from Boston, and he got bored in Madison. He'd take the train south to Chicago, and he would bounce back and forth, and he was very gregarious, and he got deeply involved in Chicago culture, and then he'd go back to Madison, and so yeah, Chicago was absolutely crucial to his
Madison
thinking.
is a town of 10 to 15,000 people then.
Yeah, 22,000 people, I think, yeah.
And Chicago was a big draw to a lot of Midwestern people, particularly in Indiana, looking to escape
Right,
from Indiana. And the Chicago was a big magnet.
And the World's Fair in 1893 had made Chicago sort of this cultural, really rich.
right, so I'm curious why we're centering like the rural as the heart of the Midwest when there are these urban spaces that seem so central.
Very
I
good
would
point.
like to comment on that because you're absolutely right. So, two cities that play an enormous part in my story about Moody and Ingersoll are Peoria and Chicago in Illinois. At the time that Robert Ingersoll moves to Peoria, it is the second largest city in Illinois. It's also the fastest growing city in Illinois, with the exception of Chicago. And it's becoming this massive, urbanized, dynamic, changing city, and it leaves an indelible mark on him. That's why there are really no monuments to Robert Ingersoll around the country except for one, and it's in Glen Oak Park in Peoria, Illinois, and it's for that reason. The years he was there absolutely shaped who he would become. Chicago is exactly the same way for Dwight Moody. Dwight Moody was born in rural Massachusetts. His dad died when he was young. He lived with a single mom. They were very poor. He becomes a very deep committed Christian and moves out west. He originally moves to Chicago as a shoe salesman, and then that didn't really pan out. And then he comes back to Chicago as the evangelizer. And I love what you said earlier about the embracing sort of traditional values mixing with that sense of like innovation and modernity. That is Dwight Moody to a T, because at the same time he's sort of modernizing these sort of Americanizing traditional Christian values, where at the same time he's literally speaking to, I mean, he reaches upwards of 1 million people when he comes back to Chicago in the 1870s and sets up what is called the Moody Tabernacle. And then he speaks to about 3 million people when he goes over to Europe. And so he embraced sort of modernity. He embraced a lot of the modern communications technologies at the time, the sort of trends, while at the same time articulating that vision. So I would say in many ways that the urban centers like Peoria and like Chicago are immensely important to telling the story of my two subjects, and I would imagine it's the same for my other panelists here.
I would stress Jane Addams too, who went
Yes.
from rural Illinois to Chicago, and that's where she did her stuff, and she was deeply devoted to the cultural maelstrom of Chicago and encouraging immigrants to be proud of their ethnic past or their ethnicity. You probably know about that, but so she's a prime example.
Frank Lloyd Wright also going from Spring Green, Wisconsin, to Chicago.
But then back.
Yeah, right.
The agrarian writers had a real problem with Chicago. They wanted to love it. And they did have, that's where the cows went to be slaughtered, so there were the stockyards there, which is kind of an agrarian thing, and that was nice. But they really were suspicious of it as a world city. So there was kind of a love-hate relationship there. We're much more positive about places like Indianapolis, which were seen as having its own literary culture, Booth Tarkington and things like that. And that the regional centers, Iowa City in the 1920s and 1930s was a center again of kind of a literary revival that had academic roots, but also very much tied to distinctively Iowa things. So those were, but again, Chicago was a problem.
John Lewis had his hand out.
We have a question over here.
I'm just thinking about the function of size in all this as one factor, influential factor. When I did my dissertation on Governor Phil Follett, and one of his professors was Max Otto, who was mentioned here. But going back to Frederick Jackson Turner, when Turner came back from Johns Hopkins, I think there was only one person in the history department at Wisconsin, maybe two. When he was a student there was only one historian there now. I know a few years ago they had 53 FTEs. And what you can do in a small organization or in a small town like Portage and so forth is something different from what you can do in a town of 30,000, 300,000. I interviewed a woman at SDSU, South Coast State University, for our 100th anniversary pictorial history. Her father had taught at Michigan State University in the early 1940s. You remember him at Michigan State when there were 3,500 students at Michigan State. You know, that's a much different institution than what Michigan State is now. And Henry Ford over here across the state in Detroit was able to manufacture an automobile and build this big organization. And what Ford could do as an individual, I mean, he could say, we're going to do this, and they did it. The Ford Motor Company now, the president, the CEO of Ford Motor Company can't say that. You got it, it's all, so what I guess there's a thought here, and that is that back when there was some uniqueness to the different regions that now has been reduced, at least by the factor of these large organizations that have global scope. And I'm thinking also, in fact, another guy from SDSU, probably our most famous graduate, Theodore Schultz. He won the Nobel Prize. He was at the University of Chicago, 1969, with his idea about But when he was the department, became department head in 1946, Robert Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago, basically said, okay, you can hire 5 new faculty. So what they do, they had meetings like 2 or 3 times a week. Everybody wrote down a list of 5 or 10 of the best economists in the world they could think of. They made a matrix, and then they started calling these guys up on the phone. They didn't go through any procedures. One of the persons they asked was Paul Samuelson, who had come out of Harvard, PhD. He was at MIT. Well, no, he didn't come. Wouldn't that have been interesting, that Paul Samuelson at the University of Chicago? But then they had all these guys like George Stigler, Milton Friedman, blah, 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 blah. Nowadays, you probably couldn't do that. You couldn't just say, okay, you got 5 hires, go do it.
And it has to go through like 8 other administrative people.
And it has to go, and that's the way the world works.
Yeah.
But this little organization here, the Midwestern History Association, is more like maybe what the Mississippi Valley History Organization was in the early 1900s, where it was still a small place where a few people can get together and solve some problems.
For sure. Do we have any questions? Any more questions before we finish up? All right. Well, this has been an excellent discussion. I want to thank all of you very, very much for being a part of the panel today. If anybody does have further questions, please catch up with any of the panelists throughout the rest of the conference or email them. I also really want to thank the Midwestern History Association for putting on the conference. I want to thank the Hauenstein Center for this wonderful venue and their terrific team, especially Scott St. Louis, who helped put the panel together. He was very, very helpful in getting this all together. And I want to thank you guys so much. Let's give our panelists a round.